Amidst the static crashes and pending storm, here we are again. The Corona Special. vk3sl. Test missions on 160, and aren't those flexible tempos just wonderful? Mr. Furtwängler, his interpretation of the second movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And it's just organic. It moves into different tempos, different intensities, and he has a wonderful way of just improvising an orchestra. Quite wondrous stuff. And I'm pleased we've changed our theme music to that. The other version was quite a bit too cerebral for me. Well, let's continue. Let's see. I don't know. We have a storm brewing. We're going to have a big storm, I think. It's all happening here. And I'm busy at the coalface. I've still got stuff to do, so I'm not going to be as hands-on today. I will be listening because the sort of work I am doing is just sort of incidental stuff, but we will persevere. Now, what do we have on the non-playlist? Let's see. Yes, this turned up this morning. I am very impressed. This is a work I had no idea about. In fact, it was completely a new, remarkable experience. It's the music of Glier, and it's a concerto for coloratura soprano. Now, we're just going to hear one movement of it. Someone has been a collector of Australian singers who's recently made their presence on YT, and it is just the most amazing sight. I've devoted hours to listening to these incredible recordings of Australian talent. So we'll hear one of these. It's Rosalind Keane, a recording made, I think, in 1958 by all accounts. Yeah, see what you think of this concerto for coloratura soprano. Opus 82 by Glier. I'm vk3sl, and we're testing here on 160 metres and streaming online on YT under a channel with my call sign as its title, vk3sl. Was she, wasn't she? Yes, you just heard. Reinhold Glier's Concerto for Coloratura Soprano, a work written in the 1940s, I think. Had its Australian premiere in 1958, I think. There's quite a bit of information here. I believe that was the Sydney Orchestra, Sydney Symph with Charles McKerris, a recording made in 1958. I think actually the premiere was a little earlier than that. And we heard the remarkable voice of Rosalind Keane. Oh, I want to find out more about Rosalind Keane. All these great singers, and it's all there for consumption. If you want to get in touch, I'll let you know what the YouTube site is. There's no point trying to describe it on air, but it's a wonderful archive, and it's all there for our indulgence. And I can tell you now, there'll be a lot more where this comes from on these test transmissions. So yeah, testing the water here. And if you do want to make contact, it's vk3sl@hotmail.com. And there's a blog spot devoted to these missions as well, with more go-to information about the streaming services. There's 2 streams, actually. We stream in 2 different formats, but that can all be discovered if you go to vk3sl.blogspot.com as the go-to place. Emails there, all the information you may or may not need. And that's the way it works here. But we are testing. These are tone tests on 160, and there's certainly no intended entertainment value whatsoever in these pathological indulgences. All right, we're going to find the mouse. We'll wake the mouse up, and we'll hear another, I think. Another one from this amazing archive. Here we have the Queen of Australian Song, Joan Sutherland, an unknown recording, a rare recording that's a part of this collection, going back to 1951, just after Joan Sutherland arrived in England, and there's nothing known about this performance. It's just her name on the label, I think. It's on shellac, and it says here, The Hidden King. Any other information? The origin of The Hidden King is an absolute mystery, and neither Joan Sutherland or her husband, Richard Mr. Bonnage, I know, had... I should know. Had any, neither Joan or Richard had any recollection of what the song is or why it was recorded. And it says perhaps it was a test pressing for a film soundtrack. So it's on one side of the shellac, but it's absolutely extraordinary. Have a listen to Joan Sutherland in her zenith. VK3SL testing. What do you think of that? Joan Sutherland, an unknown recording from 1951. So, there's so much. I'll have to save some of these up for Friday, I think. Yes, Friday missions, late night. That's where it all happens. Frank and I sort of mine the archive here and also look at what is the latest in historic recordings on YT. It's quite a gallivant of sorts. So, yep, thoroughly recommend that one. If you happen to be interested in not being entertained late on Friday evenings, do come along and partake. All right, there we go. We testing here on 160. And what have I got next? Here we have some British bands, the British dance bands of 1928. I found some more aggregate files here. This will prevent me from being too hands-on. And it's someone's Mr. Panicord has put together about 20 minutes of British dance bands. Now, I won't go through all the groups on this, but I will say that we start off with Fred Elizalde and his music. He's one of the most interesting characters. We've had a few missions on Mr. Elizalde. And this one's from the Cavalier Restaurant in London, and it's a track called Under the Moon. It is absolutely extraordinary. Amazing playing. I'm fascinated by this character. And there's only one of him, but there's a whole stack of others. We've got Deborah Simons, Billy Cotton, New Mayfair Dance Orchestra. It goes on. And these are all 78s from 1928. So we're going to hear features of that year, British dance bands, and I'm vk3sl testing.
I'll keep on loving you. There'll be no sorrow whatever, while both our hearts beat true. Days may not be bright, be dark as night, we will find the light together. Today, tomorrow, forever, I shall keep on loving you.
Everything is wrong. Bluebird, sing me a song. Tired and friendless, days are endless, lonesome all night long. Bluebird, sing me a song. A little long song is what I've been missing. Day after day I want you to live. Fly up near me, you can cheer me, please don't wait too long. Bluebird, sing me a song.
This is a test transmission from vk3sl.
Happy we'll be under a tree down by the sea. I'll serenade you, sweet ukulele maid. We two never be blue. You like me and I like you. Kisses I'll trade you, sweet ukulele maid. And when the blue sea is all a-gleaming each tree, with silver streaming while we are idly dreaming there, dear, you'll croon your hula song, then hand in hand we'll wander along to paradise, my sweet ukulele maid.
This is vk3sl. You've been listening to a selection of British dance bands from 1928. And that's care of Mr. Panicord on YT. So what did we hear? The New Mayfair Orchestra, I think, was the last track on that. I don't have any other information at hand. The file has closed itself down. So there we go. We use antiquated material here for test purposes. That's the way it works. And just a reminder that we do have ongoing afternoon missions at this time each day. It's ongoing. It's been happening since the beginning of the corona shutdown. And we have to have we need ways to express ourselves and find meaning at this time. And this is one small, crazy indulgence. And of course we do have our late night missions on Friday, so just a reminder that Frank and I host a program together where we explore a range of modulated sound material from the vaults here and also from a variety of different sources, but it's a bit of a blast. All right, next we will feature the second cassette from the series on 3DB. It's entitled The First 60 Years. Written, narrated and produced by Mr. Newton, and it came out in 1987. And so retrospective, a bit of history, and 3DB. I thoroughly enjoyed it yesterday. It was really interesting. So we'll hear cassette number 2 from this series. This is vk3sl Test Missions, and we are also streaming online if you want to be entertained. Just look up my call sign as a dedicated YouTube channel. It's all there. Alright, I don't think there's much else I need to do other than just push the play button on the cassette machine. Fingers crossed.
Radio, like its close family member television, knows it's on the right track when two groups are happy with what they're doing: the audience and the sponsor. The advertising dollar is sought out today as it's never been before. Costs are high, and for a radio station to succeed, its best friend next to its listeners has to be the man who makes commercial radio possible, the advertiser. But it's always been that way. What the angel is to theatre and the voter to our politicians, commercial radio has always had a love-hate relationship with the man who foots the bill. 3DB's history is rich with wonderful advertising success stories, but probably the greatest story of them all concerns the Burke Street optician who took a chance with the relatively new medium of radio and began a 30-year association that became more than simply sponsor and show. It became a Melbourne institution. The C&G Minstrels.
Presenting the Minstrels. With rattling bones and tambourines, the Minstrel Boys are evergreen.
This is the Minstrel Show. Yes, we are glad to bring the Minstrel Show. We'll hear the music on the pipe, the drums, and old banjo. And Mr. Solo, and Mr. Moon, this is the Minstrel Show. We bring you joy and laughter while our grand play. That's what the Minstrels are here for. We'll bring you a cheerful, the good old Minstrel Show.
Gentlemen, be seated. For a merry start to a merry show, let's sing along with the Minstrel Singers.
Stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas.
Earl Coles and Frank Garrard opened their optical firm Coles and Garrard back in the 1920s. Frank Garrard later died on a ship on his way to England. His partner Earl Coles realised that to have a successful business, people had to know about it. And he showed the insight of sponsoring the legendary 3DB program, the C&G Minstrels, heard for more than 30 years on Thursday nights at 7:30. The original stars were those aforementioned pioneers Ren Miller and Charlie Board. And throughout its life, it boasted 3DB stars that were already household names, with the C&G Minstrels offering them yet another opportunity to display their talents. Among the many producers of the show were John May, the late Mike Dyer, one of radio's greatest showmen, Leslie Ross, and an Englishman who joined 3DB in the early 50s, and who to many radio devotees even today is one of the best voices the station has ever had.
3DB Melbourne and 3LK Central Victoria, the Herald Sun stations.
That was the announcing voice of Peter Surrey, and like everybody else at the station, it wasn't enough to specialise in one thing. Versatility was the name of the game, and among Peter's many duties was a stint as producer of the C&G Minstrels, and also for a time as its compere. And it remains as one of Peter's happiest memories of the station.
It was a wonderful program. It had all the gaiety about it. It had all the tunes and things. And most of all, it was live music. And it came through. It made you laugh.
Get away with you. I've got sixpence, jolly, jolly sixpence. I've got sixpence to last me all my life. I've got tuppence to spend and tuppence to lend and tuppence to send home to my wife.
For thousands of people listening at this moment, this is an era long gone. But it wasn't only the singers and the songs they sang. The cast of the show became family friends.
It had all sorts of people in it. You remember Bones? Bones was Dick Cranman, of course.
I was having trouble with that daughter of mine again.
What is it this time?
Well, I told her she wasn't to go to the dance at the local hall last night, but she went just the same.
Oh, that's bad.
Yes, sir, and you know, this morning when she came down to breakfast, I said to her, "Good morning, daughter of Satan."
And what did she say?
"Good morning, Father."
And then there was Mark Sutherland. Mark Sutherland played the banjo, and he had a most terrific offbeat. It was really marvellous. And then, of course, there was that wonderful veteran performer, Colin Crane. That man could sing a Negro song like nobody else that I know. He really threw everything into it. It was just steam radio in those days, Bert, but it was simply marvellous the way that man could emote without the need for any pictures at all. It all came out through his voice. He was so warm and wonderful.
Oh, dusty shores will be in line again, but not for bread. No, sir, having a good time again, with a dime to spend for a shine again. You're dusty, dusty shore.
Lovely, Mr. Snowball, beautiful.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Colin Crane, and there were so many more people to thank. Those who helped make the C&G Minstrels what it was. A program that for more than 30 years made you feel better for having listened, and in the rough times, helped you get through. Every Thursday night when the final theme was sung, countless thousands of people regretted that it was going to be another 7 days before they'd feel that way again.
This is the Minstrel Show. We're glad we brought to you the Minstrel Show.
In tonight's presentation of the Minstrels, you heard Dick Cranman, Colin Crane, Perry Phillips, Heck McClellan, John Oldham, the Minstrel Quartet, Mervyn Bray, Keith Nielsen, William Smith, and Kitten Casey, Joseph Williams, Alan McCaskill, Max Pell, Fred King, Sam Dunn, Jack Dorney, this is Peter Surrey, and producer Leslie Ross.
The Minstrels are here for to bring you good cheer for the good old Minstrel Show.
And to our sick friends in hospital, we wish you a speedy recovery. and may God bless you all.
DB and music have always been close companions. Some of our earliest shows were accompanied by a lone piano. But as the station grew, so also did its ambitions. Producer Elf Potter.
The most progressive thing, and something that was years and years before its time, was the fact that 3DB employed an orchestra full-time, a staff orchestra of about 36 people.
Verdon Williams, music supervisor for the ABC in Melbourne, resigned that post to conduct the serious works of the 3DB Orchestra. With the founding of this orchestra, 3DB made radio history. In February 1949, it became the only radio station in the world, with the exception of the giant NBC network in America, to engage a permanent symphony orchestra of full-time musicians. The lighter side of music was handled by conductor William O. Flynn, who became the more sedately named William Flynn. The orchestra made records released on 3DB's own commercial record label, but none was more successful than the one recalled now by producer and program director Norm Spencer.
Of course, an orchestra was a hard thing to do, keep going. And of course, I think the only thing we ever made money on was King George VI happened to die at the time, and no one had a version of God Save the Queen. So I got the orchestra together and the Windsor Singers, and we recorded God Save the Queen and sold it all around Australia.
Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, sometimes before their time.
But in those days, we outproduced ourselves. We outproduced the market. We sold to South Africa, Canada, America, New Zealand, all around Australia. Sold a few shows to England. But we couldn't sustain the expense. We tried to put on live shows, but dare I say it, there were so many restrictions imposed on us by the Musicians' Union, which was just starting to grow then, and they wanted all sorts of dressing allowances and public performance allowances because we wanted to put on a 2-hour lunchtime show to take up some of the calls because we were committed to 10 calls a week, and we wanted to put the show on of lunchtime free, but it was going to cost us too much money, so finally we had to get rid of the orchestra.
Fortunately, other shows lasted much longer.
And then, of course, Swallows Juniors, which I started at DB with Ernie Sidney, Gano Bunning, and somebody who you know very well, little Paddy McGrath. It was beautiful.
This is a test transmission, vk3sl.
Of course, young Paddy McGrath went on to much success in the television version of Swallows Juniors, and then progressed to Channel 9's Tarak show and the wonderful Graham Kennedy era of television. She also married very well.
Tell them I'm in love with you.
It's quite the done thing these days for big stars to perform at outside venues. But this wasn't the case back in the 40s when 3DB began a historic radio program.
Music for the People started off in the Botanic Gardens, not at the present site of the music bowl. It was over the back near a lake, and the Crawfords, who we haven't mentioned, had a great influence on drama and music in radio, of course. And we used to drive the van over there with a couple of microphones and or a dozen microphones of a Sunday morning and and set up, and just used to do it, and it became so popular as a program that just about everybody in Melbourne listened to it.
Surely the great success of 3DB in its early years was its wonderful understanding of variety. On a Sunday afternoon, thousands of people gathered in the gardens to see and hear this. Hector Crawford conducting the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Meanwhile, just a mile away, sitting in the 3DB studio, preparing to play the records for the duty announcer, was a young Footscray boy who was going to make some musical history of his own. How did Ernie Sigley get to 3DB? John Eden has the answer.
Ernie Sigley, I got to the station actually because he was a choir boy the day that my wife and I were married at Christchurch in South Yarra. And the story can now be told because it's common knowledge I adore my wife, and we've been married for 36 years. And we'd gone through the immediate preliminaries, and we're going back to sign the pieces of paper and all that sort of stuff. And this little voice out of the choir said, "Sucker." And I didn't know who it was, and I wasn't going to inquire at the time. But some months later, a young bloke comes to DB, "Do you see looking for a job?" And I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Sigley." I said, "What's your experience?" He said, "Well, sir," he said, "Sir, fancy Sigley calling anybody sir." And he said, "I used to sing in the choir at South Yarra." I said, "Were you the little that said sucker?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Well, you're bloody well wrong." I said, "But I like your cheek, you can have a job." And he started, and he was operator for Danny, and I inherited him at breakfast time.
What a gift from Danny. How often does an announcer have as his panel operator someone who makes a gold record when he's only 16 years old?
Your love and mine, dear, it will shine, dear, just like the golden ring on your finger. Love isn't just for tonight, or two arms that hold me so tight. Love is a song that two must learn to sing. Love is a golden ring.
Ernie Sigley. Someone who was very important to Ernie's career, indeed to the career of almost everyone who ever sang or tried to sing on 3DB, was the pianist extraordinaire Mabel Nelson. As any singer will tell you, back in the golden era of radio, you could have the best producer in the world, the finest song in the world. But when you walked up to that old carbon microphone, if the pianist wasn't with you, you were history. And the history of 3DB shows that Mabel Nelson was with her artists all the way. Here she is with Bill Collins in a rare singing appearance, joining the Accurate One for their own special version of I Remember It Well from Gigi.
Do you recall that fateful day
when we first joined DBLK?
Ah, yes, I remember it well.
There was such fun for all to share.
And Jeff McComas had curly hair.
Ah, yes, I remember it well. Flora Mack was 17.
Darrell Bruin, 22.
Curtis Crawford made his first speech.
He said, "Goo goo."
Egg Brown dressed herself in a herald one night and went to a newspaper ball.
Her costume caught fire and burnt her entire front page sporting section and all.
She had a burn above her knee
and where her want ads used to be.
Ah, yes, I remember it well. She gave a groan and several tucks.
And blamed it on Jeff Palmer's butts.
Ah, yes, I remember it well. She ripped her herald off and didn't give a blink.
Donned the sporting globe, said I'm in the pink.
It didn't fit to be specific.
But her track gallops were terrific.
I-ho,
You'll remember us
From Mabel Nelson to a full concert orchestra and chorus. That's how the music went round and came out here at DB. An early production was syndicated throughout Australia and broke new ground in overseas markets.
With a song in my heart, the story of men and their music, of composers who really had a song in their heart.
A pretty girl is like a melody that haunts you night and day. She'll start upon a marathon and run around your brain. You can't escape. She's in your memory by morning, night, and noon. She will leave you and then come back again. A pretty girl is just like a pretty tune.
Musical production at 3DB led the way for other stations to follow. And many artists, singers and musicians owe their start and or their success to the radio station in Flinders Street that thought big.
She will leave you and then come back again. A pretty girl is just like a pretty
Women have always played a very important on-air role at 3DB. Probably more so than any other Melbourne radio station, the good shifts with big audiences on DB were often handed over to the fairer sex. In this day and age, some might question the relevance and importance of this remark. But in other times, before equality was even mentioned, let alone discussed, 3DB was proud of its female stars. The first female voice at the station was Winnie Wattle, who conducted the children's program when 3DB opened in 1927. Then there was Iris Turnbull, who remained at the station through the 20s and 30s, broadcasting the Women's Radio Service of the Air. And there was Millicent Osmond, known in the children's program as Sally Ann. Marjorie Troy was another broadcaster. Tilly the Telephone Girl, another DB character of those early years. And author and broadcaster Isabel Ann Sheed had a huge following. In later years, Elizabeth conducted The Friendly Door with Maurice Callard, in which listeners were invited to simply help each other with gifts, donations and general support. Louise Humphrey came from 3AW in 1937 and stayed for more than 20 years. Louise refused to advertise any products in her sessions until she'd personally tested their claims. As Bill McLaughlin writes in his book, From Wireless to Radio, you just had to believe it when Louise said, buy it. After Louise left radio and television, she devoted 8 years to taping textbooks for blind students in their school and university exams. She also taped the complete works of William Shakespeare. This fulfilled for her a lifetime ambition, but it took 5 years to complete this mammoth task. Many more of the industry's best ever female performers spent time here at 3DB. the delightful and very popular Stephanie
This is a
Bean,
test transmission,
alas, no longer with us,
vk3sl.
and Uncle Norman's cousin Binny from the 3KZ children's program, Binny Lum, graced our airwaves. Jean Lawson conducted one of Australian radio's best ever children's programs, but more of Jean later. And then there was that young and pert Shirley Cecil, who joined the station as a teenager to work in the office, and then she found her way to the microphone and went on to establish a fine career in radio.
See, the war was on, and this is why I was so lucky, because at school, people would say to me, and what are you going to do when you grow up? I'm going to be a radio announcer, and I said that forever, having no idea that one day I would be. I got a job here, and the war was on, you see, and they didn't have any announcers. All the fellows were leaving. So they only had older guys, and they used the women. So that's how I got to be an announcer, because there were no fellows here to be the announcers.
It must have been a wonderful place for a young person to work.
Yes, because DB used to do a lot of live shows, and we used to pack the studio with with women who used to come in for the show. It was a great thing for them to do. It filled in their afternoon, and it was warm, in the freezing cold weather. It was lovely and warm in the studio, and they used to come in very early in the morning and stay in the studio the whole day. And the show would start off, they'd come in and record Daddy and Paddy. They'd do a couple of episodes of that, and all the women would laugh and clap and, enjoy that. Stop for women only used to go on the air. That would be on for an hour. They used to have quizzes and give prizes out to the women and so forth. And then that would go on till about 4. Then there'd be a stop, and a lot of the women, the audience, would go home. A lot of them would stay in. And then at about 6 o'clock, 6:30, they used to record the minstrels. Then after the minstrels, we would come in and record What's My Line? The audience on a Thursday had a ball, because the whole day they'd been entertained in the nice, cosy studio, and it was good entertainment too.
For the staff also. And for a young person getting a job at Melbourne's most successful radio station, with some of the city's best-known faces and voices surrounding them, I wonder who the station hero was.
I think I'd have to say Eric Pearce. I think what I liked about Eric Pearce was that he spoke so well, and he sounded so good, and he was really a very, very friendly type person, and he could always join in with the fellows or with the anybody who was on the air, and I think that voice was a great voice to hear on 3DB. I'd have to say Eric Pearce.
In direct contrast to the dulcet tones of Sir Eric Pearce, there was another voice on 3DB that was so identifiably 3DB, especially on a Sunday night. Among the honour roll of great female broadcasters, we've mentioned already the likes of Elizabeth, Louise Humphrey, Jean Lawson, Stephanie Beanie. But we've left till last a name synonymous with this station. She became as much part of Melbourne as any city landmark or any powerful political figure. When you ask any former 3DB star, including Shirley Cecil, to think exotic, different, controversial, extraordinary and female, the answer is always the same.
Stephanie Dest.
Stephanie Dest was a Belgian-born dancer who came to this country to star in the musical Rose-Marie, from which she eventually took her radio theme that you hear now, Totem Tom Tom. She travelled the world as a dancer, but her world eventually became Australia, and especially Melbourne, where not only did she find radio fame with her legendary Sunday Night with Stephanie Dest, in which she interviewed stars of stage and screen, but she also became one of this city's best-known beauticians. And early in the piece, while working with the late Monty Blandford, she pioneered a new dimension in radio.
Monty and I put our heads together and we got around it this way. Mrs. Gafoop, so on, rang up Monty and she said, will you please ask Miss Desk, what can I do about the open pores and so on. So I said, oh, Monty, will you tell Mrs. So-and-so what it was? And that's how we did it. That was the very first talk back.
Miss Stephanie Dest made her debut on radio in a unique way, which even in today's blasé era shows a lot of class.
Well, they asked me to do something. I didn't know what. So I read the Bible. You know, not from the religious point of view, but from the literary point of view. And then I read the Salome of Oscar Wilde with Herbert Brown playing Jocanan and Fifi Banvard. The old-timers would remember all these, you know, playing Herodias. We did it in 2 installments. Then I had the bright thought of having a session for boys, and we read the Lays of Ancient Rome, and I dropped the book, which was very embarrassing. And, well, I had a good time. I worked there every Sunday, you know. I think they paid me 2 guineas, something like that.
Listeners to her program certainly got more than 2 guineas worth. One of the compelling things about Stephanie Dest's show was to listen every week to see if eventually there would be a guest who was not either overawed by or incredulous of the show's hostess. Miss Dest was also a marvellous character around the station. Shirley Cecil.
And she used to have this huge big car, a big Mercedes or something, always even better than a Mercedes, whatever that is. And she used to say, I am running late, I cannot park it. And she used to just leave it parked on the tram line, and she'd come in and drop the keys to the girl at the front counter and say, get someone to move my car, I am running late. And she'd have to find something. Usually it was Jeff Cork or somebody who was only a lad in those days, but he was allowed to put the keys in the car and just drive the car off. She didn't have time to, you know, or couldn't park it. It was so big, and there was never any room along Flinders Street anyway. But Jeff, it was always his job to get the keys and move the car. The trams would be held up on the, you know, that didn't worry Stephanie. She was running late for her program. Oh, she was really very funny.
And marvellous. How often have you heard that the real test of a celebrity is for them to be on stage or on air exactly what they are in real life? With Stephanie Dest, what you saw was what you got. And Melbourne women got something new and exciting from her beauty-wise. Another pioneering move by Stephanie Dest.
You know, I was the first person doing the cold wave here. Women would know what that is. And I talked about it over 3DB. And when I got back to my salon, there were queues down the stairs and everything waiting. Oh, it was marvellous.
Marvellous. That's how her legion of fans felt about her Sunday night program too. But all good things come to an end.
I was very sad. You know, I loved everybody, and I was part of the station. And all the engineers and everyone came to say goodbye to me because I was part of the furniture here. It was very sad.
Stephanie Dest's Sunday night program came to an end in 1969. And on this night, the tables were turned on her, as Dick Cranbourne made an unlisted and surprise appearance. They were both great radio performers in very different ways, but they both liked to chat, and the only casualties on this historic night were agreement on the facts and the single microphone used to capture both their voices. It never seemed to work the same again.
Thank you, Stephanie, very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, this is not the first time I've been connected with this program, although I have never been on this program.
Not this program,
no,
you used to be on with me on Friday morning.
But what I'm going to say, Stephanie, is that I haven't been on this end of your program, but I've been on the listening end.
Have you really?
Oh, I have on many,
Isn't
many
that
occasions, and you have had some wonderful people here. But as far as your other station was concerned in the daytime, well, you and I were together on the Stephanie Dest program, 1:30, I think it used to start. Was it 1:30
No,
in the
it was,
daytime?
it was 10:30 on Friday morning for a long time.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Oh, it got switched eventually
It got
to
switched,
1:30.
yes, that's right.
But for years, we were 10:30 Friday morning.
I remember, yes. Stephanie, with you as far as radio
Look,
is concerned.
I am 29 next birthday. That is my story. I'm sticking to it. The fact that I have a daughter and 3 grandchildren is a bit embarrassing.
Yes, it
but
is.
That's my story, and I stick to it.
And you're stuck with it.
Absolutely.
29, yes.
Oh, say 30.
Well, I suppose I can go back with you here at 3DB.
Yes.
25 years? 26?
Well,
I was here 26.
Oh, no, I wasn't there then.
No.
I started, I think it was 1942, during the war. I know that I used to get into trouble.
Right, 1942.
No, look, I've never played Tondaleo in Australia. I played it on the continent.
Did you?
Yes.
Oh, you didn't play it here in Australia?
Not here. I played Wanda in Rosemary, but it was at the same time.
At the same time,
and
that's right.
lots of people said they'd seen me in... well, of course, people are mistaken sometimes. I still occasionally meet people who say that I was in the famous sextet in Florodora. That was 1902, and believe it or not, Dick, that was even before my time.
And then came her time on that night, the 13th of April, 1969, for Stephanie to say goodbye.
Good night, listeners. This is Stephanie Des signing off, and I'm very sad to say goodbye to you. Good night, listeners.
And so, the end of an era.
When my grandpa, Chief Chicky-Cotem, took Grandpa out for totem, tom-tom, totem-tom-tom. First they'd move their feet very slow like the drums would beat a tattoo like totem-tom-tom, totem-tom-tom.
Transmission, vk3sl.
Stephanie Dest, an important part of the 3DB story. She was different, larger than life, and a carbon copy of no one. She was a radio pioneer. Miss Dest is now also retired from her beauty salon, and with her departure, the hairdressing and beauty industry in Melbourne aren't the same, nor is Sunday night radio.
This is vk3sl, test missions on 160 metres in a narrowband FM mode. We're listening to a retrospective on 3DB. This is tape 2 out of 3 tapes. We heard tape 1 last night. These are cassettes produced by Bert Newton in 1987, I think. All right, we'll just fast forward to the end of the side and then we'll see if we've got the next part of the offering. And we will listen further. We'll see what's happening here. This is taking a while. Okay, so we'll have to do a little bit of fast forwarding to the end of the tape. It's a tape loop machine. Here we go. It's taking its cue now. And are we ready? I'm hoping. Oh, wait a minute. We have to just click off that. Right, we're just testing the water here, queuing up the tape. The cassette recorder's not on the same level as everything else. I'm having to duck down low. Yeah, I think we're ready to go with part 2, or part 2.2 of our 3DB retrospective.
This imposing piece of music is called Heart of Oak, and for 40 years it introduced the news on 3DB. And news has always been one of the mainstays of the station. One of the largest news-gathering organisations in the world, the Herald and Weekly Times, has always physically towered over the studio areas of the station. The grand old lady of the print media, so much in the news of recent times, has at various times in the past proven to be a wonderful ally in our news endeavours. At other times, she's seen as simply as a poor cousin or just radio, who cares? Whether our master or mistress has been on side or not, 3DB has always enjoyed a great reputation for news and the gathering of same. In the modern era, men like John Worthy, Peter Van and Arthur Higgins hold enviable reputations. In the years gone by, some of the finest radio newsreaders ever to turn the page of a news bulletin were here at 3DB. Testimony to that is that Melbourne's 3 major television newsreaders all started at 3DB: Brian Naylor, Mel Walden and David Johnston. The doyen of them all, Sir Eric Pearce, allowed his dulcet tones to harmonise with Heart of Oak back in the 40s and 50s, establishing on radio that extraordinary news style of credibility and charm that translated across the television with so much success. For over 30 years, the most identifiable news voice on our station was Jeff McComas. He played many roles at the station, but he'll always be remembered especially for his magnificent news presence. He was an inspiration to a number of our present DBers. Example, Lawrence Costin.
I was very impressed with Jeff McComas, and I did a lot of Sunday afternoons when I was a junior announcer, and Jeff would be in doing several special programs on Sunday afternoon, business equipment, universal flexible trusts, and I was just the link man, you know, time calls and so forth, and I'd be sitting back and I'd be watching Jeff McComas do these commercials, and he'd have the paper in front of him and you could see him enunciating and crossing his T's and dotting his I's, but he was really selling. I was most impressed with the way Jeff McComas could read a commercial with the emphasis on certain words, the pausation and the colour. He was very good.
Indeed, Lawrence, he was very good. And that's how the sponsors felt too. Here's an example of the McComas touch.
Make your coffee the way you like it best, essence, ground or powder. Make it black and steaming hot. Add carnation milk, and you've got the best cup of coffee you've ever tasted. Double rich carnation makes any coffee taste better. Gives a rich, creamy smoothness. Brings out the real coffee flavor. Ask for carnation milk from contented cows.
With that lovely soft touch and that voice, he could sell anything, especially news. Back in Jeff's day, radio didn't present hourly news 24 hours a day that we're used to now. The news was brought to you in quarter-hour blocks, 4 times, sometimes 5 times a day, and Jeff at times did them all, especially those with the largest audience.
Well, the 3 most important bulletins of news were at 7:45 a.m., 12:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. Remember, this is prior to television. So they were the news services. They were quarter-hour bulletins, and to read the 7 o'clock news at night, you got your photo in the paper.
And here's how Jeff got his picture in the paper.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this broadcast with a news flash from the Herald. I've just been informed that His Majesty King George VI died peacefully in his sleep at Sandringham a few hours ago. The King was 56 years of age. That's all the information we have at the moment, but repeating that news flash from the Herald, His Majesty King George VI died peacefully in his sleep at Sandringham a few hours ago. God save the Queen.
In those decades that Jeff was the news voice of 3DB, was he like the comedian who wanted to play Hamlet? Did he feel restricted by the written script? With variety performers like Jon Stewart, Dick Cranbourne and Bill Collins around him, did he long to loosen his tie, dare I say, let his hair down, and join in with his variety colleagues?
No, I never considered myself a variety performer. I can't sing and I can't dance, and I can't do any of those things. I don't really see myself as a variety person. And in comparing things, I've got to, I find that I did find that I did my best work when I was really well prepared.
One more time, please, Jeff?
Did my best work when I was really well prepared.
Really? You were saying, Jeff?
I didn't very much like doing things in the spontaneous ad-lib sort of style, which Bert Newton's famous at, you know. But no, I felt I did my best work when I was thoroughly prepared and knew exactly what I wanted to say.
I wonder if Jeff was prepared the morning this happened.
This message from Paris will doubtless be intelligible to women only. It says, Christian Dior has swapped his H line for an A line. The main difference is a flare introduced in skirts with a movable waistline and broken effects representing the crossbar of the letter A, which may be set high or low. The silhouette is always broken horizontally by a variety of ways. Shoulders continue narrow and generally unpadded with set-in sleeves, though more squared effects are sometimes achieved by the absence of the high sloping collars shown for winter. The sleeveless armhole is a leading trend for streetwear as well as for formal clothes. Dior, whose collection was shown yesterday, has done a few very drastic things to the neckline of afternoon and cocktail clothes. Apparently to counteract the impression given last year that he doesn't like bosoms. The V's, whether narrow or wide from the shoulder blades, have a tight construction through the rib cage, pushing... One deep plunging V is cut to the bottom of the rib cage. The high collarless necklines receive a new banded trim of self fabric which is cut separately and tacked at the front or evolved from modified draping. The loose arched loop, Dior calls them ribbon collars, fall free at the back. There's much more of this sort of thing, but that's all we have time for.
It is hard to keep a straight face. Okay, another day, another news service, and another gentleman endeavouring to keep that straight face. A fine DB voice from the past, Roland Redshaw.
Lunchtime crowds parted and traffic snarled as a nude man ran past the taxation department in the heart of Sydney today. Eyewitnesses said the man appeared from completely nowhere, naked and obviously distressed. As women screamed, he ran along the pavement and into Martin Place. He slipped on the wet roadway and drivers... I beg your pardon.
It's always very handy to have a news theme to go to, except that sometimes it takes you a long time to find it. Anyway, back to Jeff McComas. He's been the inspiration for so many radio people. But who was his inspiration? None other than the aforementioned Sir Eric Pearce. Producer Alf Potter.
Jeff even went to the extent of buying a pipe and copying Eric. He really adored Eric Pearce and admired his presentation so much because Eric was the peak of sophistication as far as radio was concerned.
And what does Jeff himself have to say about his mentor?
In those days, and I'm talking of the 1940s, the late 40s, early 50s, he was the identity of the station. He read the news at the most important times of day. Most people thought, in the community at large I'm talking of, most people thought he was the, if not the manager, then certainly the owner of the station. They had heard of Dave Worrell somewhere in the background, but Pearce was the person who was the station of 3DB. And I think he put an enormous stamp on the station in those particular years, which lasted, I suppose, for about 20 years or so.
And how does, my dear friend, Sir Eric Pearce reflect on his 3DB years?
I think that it was the most stimulating time that I had in my early life. I was with a bunch of people associated with 3DB and the Herald who were wise, supportive, and to whom I was able to give my loyalty. I learnt an awful lot. I met a lot of very, very interesting people during my time there, and I don't think I shall ever forget it. I'm still very fond of it.
But what's the secret to Sir Eric's technique in radio? And, for that matter, in television too?
I've always imagined this microphone, into which I'm now speaking, and the camera and microphone combined in television,
from vk3sl.
represented Betty and a group of close friends. When I was reading news, the kind of expression I would get would come not consciously, perhaps, but through that philosophy which I developed over the years. And I've never been inhibited. I've never, ever been inhibited about standing in front of a microphone, and that may have something to do with my ego. I don't know. We've all got it. But I try to keep it under control, as I'm sure you do, and most other people I know who've been successful keep it under control, but you've got to have it to get anywhere.
And certainly Sir Eric Pearce did get more than somewhere or anywhere. Regardless of what his original plans were for his professional journey, what evolved was one of the most successful and inspiring careers in both radio and television. Sir Eric was one of the relatively few radio men who made the transition to television with great success. But more importantly, his reputation as a man should be envied by one and all who work in this industry. His segments are pre-recorded, so he isn't in the studio with me at the moment. But let me report that this delightful gentleman, in his early 80s, is recovering well after a successful operation. He's still in residence at Channel 9, and he's still the best. For once in my life, I gave the final word to Eric.
Well, to all of you, anyhow, it's been a great privilege and a great pleasure to be associated with this historic occasion. And may I end up with something many of you perhaps will recognize, my usual salutation. I don't know that I'll say goodbye, but it won't be goodbye, I hope. But in any event, I'll say au revoir, and God bless you and you.
This familiar piece of music is called Grandstand. For the record, on the record, played by the Queen's Hall Light Orchestra. And for 30 years it introduced on 3DB sport. This station has always had a very close affinity with sport from its very earliest days. One of the boys who came through the ranks is recognised today as one of sport's greatest contributors.
Referee levers them away once more. Famershon bleeding from the nose now. And the referee gets them away once more. Here comes the decision. It's a left and right into the body by Harada. Pushed Famershon back into the corner. Laying in there on him. And here comes the bell. And a draw. The referee has made it a draw.
Just as Ron Casey has been synonymous with sport on TV for 30 years, for almost as long in the domain of radio, Ron captured the excitement, the thrills of all sports, big and small, via the radio microphone for 3DB. His has been a magnificent career, which just recently reached a temporary punctuation point when he announced his retirement as general manager of HSV7. But it wasn't beer and skittles in the very early days. His good friend Bill Collins recalls.
If ever a fella has dragged himself up to a wonderful position, Ron has, and he's a great bloke, Ron. Ron had a terrible problem with stuttering in his early days, of course, and he was able to overcome this. And he doesn't now, except when he perhaps gets very tired. He was a great worker. I don't know whether the Americans say indefatigable. Well, that's how Ron was. And he quickly took over when Eric Welsh retired. He did everything that Eric was involved in because he'd been more or less apprenticed to him in the wrestling and the bikes and you name it. And then when television came along, Ron... After 2 or 3 years became involved in the sporting side of television, and the sport in those days in the news and television used to be you'd get the early editions of the Herald, or as late as you could, and you'd cut bits out and read them from a piece of paper. That's how it was done in the early days of the telly. And Ron did this very successfully and gradually brought other programs that originally from radio, such as Sports Forum and that sort of thing, took it onto television and an early morning, Saturday morning racing program, etc., and showed that he had a great knack for getting things organised, getting them together, and when the opportunity arose down there, he was the natural person to take over and be in charge of Channel 7. His history back here at 3DB is most important. He's been involved in so many things in the station.
That early speech impediment that Bill mentioned is not hidden by Ron.
I had a stammer. When I got nervous, I used to fall over myself. And Eric Pearce made the suggestion that I might get some help if I went to see a woman called May Hoban, who was she certainly wasn't a speech therapist, but I think she really was. She was a drama coach at the Pilgrim Theatre up in East Melbourne. And I used to toddle up there twice a week and stand up there and do the great declamatory verses and count to 200 on one breath, and it was terrific. Just do as you're told and do it again, you know. But eventually she overcame it.
Ron Casey has enjoyed the best of both worlds, 3DB in its halcyon era and the excitement of the early television days. But while he was caught up in the euphoria of all that was happening at Channel 7 down there in Dorcas Street, when he looked back toward the city at his old alma mater, 3DB, where had the station gone wrong?
I think that probably 3DB was just a little slow to adjust to television. I think 3UZ probably was the first station to make a move to compete with television
by devising a different form of radio. And I think it was probably at that point that there were changes of management and things changed. And in the changeover, I think 3DB just lost the opportunity to move quickly to compete with television in a different way. I think 3DB probably tried to compete with television too long in its old style.
Think of Ron Casey and you think of World of Sport. Think of World of Sport and you think of Lou Richards. But Lou hasn't always been a television star. He came from 3DB. His close friend Ron Casey knows how it all began.
He was offered the situation of doing a column in The Sun, and on the same basis, it was an in-house situation. It'd be a good idea if he joined 3DB, and he did. Not just as a football commentator, but he worked for a long time with Dick Cranbourne on the breakfast program. And Louis is a very fast learner, and I think that Lou learnt his trade very, very well. Mind you, some of those Saturdays, he did the breakfast session on a Saturday morning with Dick. And some of the Saturday mornings, Lou was not actually at his best, but he was still very good, because Friday night down at the Phoenix used to be a fairly late night. But Lou would front on Saturday morning, and Dick Cranbourne would give him plenty. But he learnt the business very well, and he was involved with 3DB for a long, long time.
Lou seemed to take to the media like the proverbial duck to water.
Yes, although, of course, he'd been in hotels for quite a while. He went to a hotel firstly when he was playing at Collingwood, in the Town Hall Hotel in North Melbourne. And from there he graduated to the Phoenix and Flinders Street, the branch office of the Herald and Weekly Times. And of course, Lou had a great style as a publican. I mean, he really did. He could tell a story, he could listen, and his personality was right. And so he was very comfortable in that situation. And I suppose, to a certain extent, that comfort stood him in good stead when he moved into radio.
And some years after moving into radio here at 3DB, he did the breakfast program firstly with Dick Cranbourne, and then he joined a very talented young man in John Anderson.
I was going to tell you a story, as a matter of fact.
Why don't you tell me a story, Lou?
Well, about this two fellows on the end of the pier, fishing.
Yeah.
And one had a beautiful fiberglass rod with a beautiful reel and all the proper, the gear to go with it. The other fellow had just a bamboo with a piece of string and a bent pin and a worm on it. The bloke with the good gear couldn't catch any fish at all. But the other fella's picking fish out left and right. He can't stop catching fish. And finally the fella with the good gear is getting dirty on this. And he said to the bloke with the crook gear, he said, how come you can catch all the fish? You got a rotten rod and everything about it's crook. Well, the fella said, I'll tell you what I do. He said, when I'm going fishing, I get to bed. My wife's lying on her left side. I fish on the left side of the pier, and I catch all the fish. If I'm going fishing the next time and she's lying on her right side, I stray to the right side and I catch all the fish. The fella said, well, what happens when your wife's lying on her back? He said, I don't go fishing.
And that's Lou. Lou Richards, a great character. Speaking of great characters, just for a few minutes back to one we were speaking of earlier, John Stewart. Everyone has a story on John, including Ron Casey.
I did a bit of wrestling in the old days, in very early days. And John Stewart, if he was in the mood, as he used to sometimes get in the mood, he'd want to wrestle me. And many of the time we've fallen down amongst the records in the record library, and I remember one Hague Cup, which was the golfing match between the radio stations, a very big event in its day. We played at Kingswood, I think it was, and after the dinner, John wanted to wrestle me. It was very difficult in the rose bushes, I can assure you.
Ron Casey's thoughts on Lou Richards and John Stewart. And while asking Ron to hand out bouquets, we have to keep a very special one for his very close friend, Bill Collins.
Bill is the ultimate professional. Bill's the sort of guy that you can ask to do any job, and you'll know that it'll be well done. And he's so cooperative, always has been. In the early days at Channel 7, when things were a bit bumpy, I'd phone Bill, want a commercial done or some help somewhere. And Bill would come to the phone and he'd say, okay, what time do you need me? Not how much or what for or anything else. That's the sort of guy he is. But a very, very professional broadcaster.
And what better opportunity do we have than this to remember one of Bill's best ever racing moments, which also happens to be one of his most recent. The finish of the 1986 WS Cox Plate at Moonee Valley.
Here come the New Zealanders, our Waverley Star and Bone Crusher. They've raced to the lead, 600 out. Have they gone too early?
2 lengths to Drought running up the third from Society Bay. They were followed then by Drawn Under the Whip at the head of the others, Dinky Flyer. But our Waverley Star, he got a half length to Bone Crusher. He's gone for the whip on Bone Crusher. 3 lengths to Drought, followed then by Dinky Flyer and Drawn. But the 2 great New Zealanders have come away on the turn. Our Waverley Star, a half length Bone Crusher. The Big Red won't give in. Drought running on. Bone Crusher responds to the whip. The roars of the crowd. He races up to our Waverley Star. 100 out. Bone Crusher, our Waverley Star. Stride for stride. Nothing in it. Our Waverley Star, the rails. Bone Crusher, the outside. And Bone Crusher races into equine immortality. $1.5 million as he photo finishes our Waverley Star. Third is the Filbert, followed by Drought. Next is Dandy Andy, followed behind them by...
I believe the only problem with the media hype of Bill Collins as the accurate one is that it doesn't say enough. He certainly has accuracy, but so much more. Bill Collins' name will always remain up there with the biggest and the best in the history of sport and 3DB. So far in saluting the stars of DB, we've paid homage to Ren Miller and Charlie Board, Dick Cranbourne and John Stewart, John Eden, Jeff McComas, Sir Eric Pearce, Ron Casey, Lou Richards and Bill Collins. But there's been one serious omission.
This is Monty Blandford calling rheumatism sufferers. Why let the nagging, depressing pain of rheumatism get you down? Get quick relief for 1 and 6 at your chemist or store with Rue Pills. Rue Pills kill pain. RHU, Rue Pills gently remove poisonous waste matter. For rheumatism, backache, neuritis, joint pains, get Rue Pills today.
That was the voice of Francis Victory Blandford, known to 3DB listeners for more than 2 decades as Monty Blandford. Monty did most of the general announcing shifts that an announcer could do at DB, but he'll always be remembered particularly for his Philosopher's Scrapbook, a program in which he read pieces of prose, poetry and philosophy by famous and not so famous authors. His program was so popular that books were published containing his personally selected pieces, and they were bestsellers for their time, not only in Melbourne, where he was a household name, but interstate, where the books sold solely on their content, with no help from the fame of the author. Anyone who has a copy of Monty Blandford's Philosopher's Scrapbook in their library has a collector's item on which it's very hard to put a price. From an historical radio point of view, they're almost priceless. Monty the man, like John Stewart, was a real character. As with John, he was a one-off. There was no one quite like Monty Blandford, or if there was, he certainly didn't work on radio. On air, Monty reminisced, read commercials, sometimes dithered as only he could. But all the while, he had that touch of magic that makes for out-of-the-ordinary radio. He had the gift of communication. Off-air, he was just as individual. His studio manager and fellow announcer, Maury Callard, remembers Monty.
Well, I can tell you about Monty and his Philosopher's Scrapbook and all that sort of thing with Monty. He was an irascible, delightful, aggravating person. If you like, he'd advise wonderfully well. He'd compile stuff beautifully. He'd present things well for 6 weeks. And then the 7th week, well, it was quite a different nature. I liked Monty. I liked his work.
And so did 75% of Melbourne radio listeners who chose to listen to their Monty. There are many stories about him. Here's John Eden with one of the most delightful.
The 8:45 bulletin on a Sunday morning was very important. Everybody listened to DB News. And at that stage, we're working over in the old studios in Flinders Street. And the staff lockers were in the same same studio area. And we had a fellow by the name of Monty Blandford, who's gone to heaven, God rest him. But Monty had a dreadful case of emphysema, and also he was a bad asthmatic. And it also is half blind. I think he's blind in one eye. In fact, I think he had a glass eye. And he was also pretty deaf. Apart from all that, he's a rather nice sort of bloke. But he'd come up when you were working into the studio, and these metal lockers, you know, he'd put his coat and hat and stuff in there, and bang, it'd go, you know, while you were working. And it was all pretty tense, you know. You were working for 3DB and you didn't want to make any mistakes. And then you'd have your news in front of you, and we had what we used to call the Bible, in other words, a working schedule, an operation schedule, and he'd come over and take this from underneath you while you were reading the news. Pardon me, and that leads to another point, that cough. And this is what happened to Danny. There were two buttons alongside the microphone. One was to cut off the microphone so you could cough if you felt the need to do that, and the other one was communication with the engineers down below. Well, Danny's having his ordeal reading the news, you see, and all the clatters going on from Monty and all the rest, and the coughing and the spluttering and then the coming over and taking of the schedule from underneath his news. Danny reaches out, and obviously he's going to pull the wrong button, isn't he, you see? So he pulls the wrong button and says, excuse me, Lord, but it's necessary. He said, for Christ's sake, Mont, would you please be quiet? And over the air it went. Anyway, that's right, he continued with the news. And very few protests, actually. But the next morning he got a note from Sir Jack Williams. Now, Jack Williams was that stage the big boss of the Herald. Delightful man who loved his personalities around him. But he could be rather nasty on occasion. But anyway, the note came into Danny. Danny, I appreciate your remark. I enjoyed it very much. But is that the sort of thing you should say when people are going to church?
It may sound trite, but it's true. To many people, their way of going to church was through Monty's Philosopher's Scrapbook.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Now, does that sound like the sort of man who'd clatter around the studio and annoy his fellow announcers? I had the pleasure of meeting Monty only once. I was a very young lad, about 13, I guess. I had a friend who was a turntable operator here at DB, and with Monty's permission, he invited me in to see them at work. I was enthralled at my tender age to see my friends spinning in the huge transcription records which contained the popular serials of the day, the multi-track records providing the commercial breaks, and Monty himself sitting at the announcer's console, scripts everywhere, aiming a gong stick for chimes inaccurately almost every time, but through all of this using that microphone as a dear friend. While his monument is Philosopher's Scrapbook, Monty has another claim to fame. It's not generally known that Monty compared the first hit parade on Melbourne radio.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once more, the Hit Parade of Victoria is on the air, brought to you by independent theatres. The Johnson story is at Kinema Albert Park and Village Toorak. It will be at National Richmond tomorrow, then It Happened One Night. The Guilt of Janet Ames is at Astor St Kilda, whilst the Maltese Falcon will be at Burnley Theatre tomorrow, and then Footsteps in the Dark, whilst the latter picture, Footsteps in the Dark, is at Adelphi North Carlton tomorrow, and then the Maltese Falcon. Plaza Chelsea screens The Bishop's Wife until Tuesday, then This Man Is Mine. And in the city, My Brother Jonathan is at the Grosvenor. Well, now for the hits. Hit number 8 this week is I'm Looking Over a Four-Leaf Clover. Tonight it's played by Russ Morgan and his orchestra, with vocal by the Ames Brothers and ensemble.
The Hit Parade on Sunday night at 6:30 was a runaway success, but a less likely DJ than Monty Blandford you'd be hard-pressed to find. Actually, DB's first DJ was in the late 50s. It was Jeff Cork, who went on to become the first man seen on Melbourne television, and the near immortal Corky, king of the kids. But when he was a kid, before he became a DJ, he started in a much humbler position at DB. What were his feelings?
Terror. Well, it was an institution that, it was an institution, and still is, and I'm sure will be for years. However, it was complete terror because I went as an office boy and I was getting sandwiches from Eric Pearce and Maury Callard, and that was, very, very exciting, wasn't it?
Exciting enough for Jeff to persevere and progress to breakfast turntable operator and a chance to get on the air.
And we used to start at 6 o'clock and start testing at 1:45, playing a few discs to check out the balance and all that thing. And you'd always hope that the announcer wasn't there because that would give you a chance to have a bit of a chat and say, this is 3DB Melbourne, or 3DB Melbourne, 3LK Central Victoria, testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that was very exciting. And you'd play a record or half of a record and then get back on. And as soon as the announcer walked in, you'd be furious and you always hoped he'd be late. And that happened occasionally, and you'd be on there for 10 minutes by yourself, and that was very, very exciting.
Not nearly as exciting as the times ahead when eventually Corky was given his real break. And each night, the young Geoffrey Cuthbert Cork broke tradition at DB and went from, as I mentioned before, being an announcer to one of those newfangled DJs. And this is the theme that introduced him. Deep Purple. Corky's program was a collection of the best and most modern music around. Always melodic, always chosen by Jeff with his impeccable taste in music. But the other fascination for his listeners was that in this exciting era of the 50s, when the big stars were coming to Australia, Corky was not only meeting them, but actually rubbing shoulders with them.
After one of the shows with Nat King Cole, who of course was a great pianist, as well as being such a beautiful singer, at the Savoy Plaza where they stayed in those days, and we were they had a table set up for them those people to come back after midnight, and there were about 12 of us at the table, and that was all, and the dining room was empty, and we had a meal and or a snack or a couple of drinks and sitting around having a chat, and he disappeared, and all of a sudden we heard a piano tinkling in the background and wondered who's doing that. And it happened to be Nat Cole, who was just walking back from the toilet, or I've got no idea where he'd been, and sat down and started picking out songs at around about 1, and he tinkled away at the piano until about 5. And that experience was just wonderful, because we eventually strolled down and sat around and listened. And he didn't play anything. He'd play half a tune and then wander on to the next and ask for another Jack Daniels, and we produced a bottle, and he'd sit there and he was just a great man.
From Nat King Cole to another legendary star.
Louis Armstrong came out here for Lee Gordon too, but Melbourne was his first city on an Australian-wide tour, and he, or the Lee Gordon organisation, decided that they'd like to have some 30-minute interviews to send to the other stations in the other states, and they asked me to do them, and that was quite, exciting and pleasant. And he was only here in Melbourne for 3 days, and then he had a couple of days off, and then went to Sydney and whatever it was. And I virtually spent 3 days with him. And I think that was the first bit of graft I ever got. They paid me £10 for 3 days' work. Well, that was quite exciting. £10 was a hell of a lot, wasn't it? And spending 3 days with Louis Armstrong was quite incredible. And plus his entourage and his wife, Lucille. And he had Dr. Pugh, his private physician, his private valet. And he was a very fascinating man. And he'd sit, and I'd be sitting around in his suite. They stayed at Chevron in those days, and say, "All right, man, you can come out now and we'll do another take." So you'd stroll out, you'd do 10, 15 minutes or whatever it had to be. "That's enough." And he'd go and have a shower and order a meal. This could be at 2 and 3 in the morning. He lived a very funny sort of lifestyle.
And speaking of lifestyles, Jeff even got to interview Frank Sinatra. And there's a story there too.
Sinatra came out with a lady called Anne McCormick, who was a fine singer. And it was the time that he'd attacked journalists and reporters and those sort of people at the entrance to the stadium, because he was a little bit cross, I think, with publicity that he'd received. And this gentleman, who was quite a popular radio interviewer, not with Mr. Sinatra, I can add you. You had to call him that too, Mr. Sinatra, all the time. And he started off his interview, and I was the next cab off the rank. I was standing in the queue. And he said, it's nice to interview a man who came out with Anne McCormick to star on The Big Show, Frank Sinatra. Well, of course, that quite annoyed Frank. And you, having interviewed thousands of people, would know how difficult it is when you get a yes and no answer. And that's what he gave this fella. He said, is it nice to be in Australia? Yes. Well, normally when you're chatting with a person, you're thinking of the next question, aren't you? And if you're just getting yeses and nos, you get a nothing interview. And that's what he got. And I thought, oh, dear me, I was a nervous wreck. And I went and turned on my little recorder after this guy left. And said, it's so nice to be with you, Mr. Sinatra, and thank you for having me. And I enjoyed your show last night, and it was great. And you had to butter up to him a little bit. And if you didn't, you'd be off your brain, because they had about 5 or 6 of the biggest men I've ever seen in my life standing around. I don't know whether they carried his bags or his toothbrush, but they were pretty big. And he let go and gave me a fantastic interview. And it was so good that it was later played in the States, because he got right down to earth about lots and lots of things.
Little would Corky know when interviewing Frank Sinatra that in not too many years to come, in Melbourne, his face would be as well known as Mr. Sinatra's, and his fame at a local level would equal the same said gentleman. Jeff played the strains of Deep Purple for the last time in mid-1956 when he journeyed from Flinders Street to Bendigo Street in Richmond and began his career in the new medium of television. But his radio times were lovely while they lasted.